Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session, which, as Nick says, is going to be in two parts. In the first part of this session, Professor Marzia Traverso and Dr. Ben Allen, and I can see that I think Ben has now joined, and there's Marzia too. This is brilliant. They will make some introductory remarks outlining the topic and set out some of the main issues to which it gives rise. I say topic or topics, which perhaps we should say. Marzia Traverso is the head of the Institute of Sustainability in Civil Engineering at RWTH Aachen University. And Dr. Ben Allen is the research director of the Institute for European Environmental Policy, the IEEP. But as Nick said, the key point is that Marzia is the rapporteur and Ben indeed the co-rapporteur of the technical working group of the Platform for Sustainable Finance, which is developing screening criteria in a number of key areas. And in particular, as I said, we're focusing today on the circular economy and on protecting biodiversity and ecosystems. So without more ado, I'm going to hand the floor over to them. I'm not sure who's going to start, but I'm sure you've worked it out between you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you for the introduction. I hope that you hear me well.
Very well.
That's good. Okay, yes, today we are very happy to give you a bit of insight of the work that we are doing in the technical working group. No, so we, as you know, we are technical working group. We are responsible to work to focus our attention on the 4 further environmental objective. That means circular economy, pollution prevention, water, sustainable use of water, and biodiversity. I will give you as first a bit of an overview, so how works our work, actually what we are doing, how we are proceeding. Then I pass the word to Ben to describe how we actually work with environmental objectives, so how we fix the main headlines, and then we go directly in more details on the 2 aspects. I mean, we do that also because I want to be clear. We will give you as much as information we can, but we are still working on it. No, so I cannot give you what the criteria are, not yet, but we are almost there. I mean, we are not so far away from the external consultation, so you will have access to all the information. So again, so we focus on the 4 objectives, but anyway, for some specific economic activity, we are going to have a look. We are looking at also mitigation and adaptation, because they were not considered. The ones in particular were not considered for the delegated act. We are, I mean, as you know, we are a group of people. Actually, we are around 100 people working on this. We are divided for sector teams. I mean, we grouped us for sector teams. We assigned. We received already at the beginning of our work a set of economic activity that had been prioritized to work as a first batch. But just, I mean, that's the first batch, so nothing to be worried, because that will be a continuous work from the platform. So we have to start from somewhere. So, and we are, our main goal is to define which are the criteria that can help investor and company to identify how they can make a substantial contribution to those, to one each, for each environmental objective. Of course, it means that we already identify which are for the economic activity that we have been prioritized, which are the main environmental objective more interesting, more important, where they can actually bring a substantial contribution. So substantial contribution, and of course, substantial contribution criteria, but then of course, for the others, we have to also define criteria to that can deliver do not significant harm, because that is the definition of sustainable activity for the taxonomy. as I said, we received at the beginning of our work around 60 activities. So, and then we share to them with lots of with people. We were at the beginning, we were around 40 people for the technical working group, but because we have a 60 activity, we grouped and we identify some gap in expertise. So we have to, and we actually engage with the organization, official organization members of the platform to identify experts that can help support us in this development. As I said, one important work was to define the headline ambition level. So, of course, with mitigation and adaptation, we have a Green Deal. So we have the Paris Agreement. So we have a reference, a clear reference in terms of indicator and numbers. That's not the same for the other four. And you see that in particular, when we talk about circular economy, it's particularly complicated because the circular economy can be several things. So and there are not yet a standardized set of indicators. There are already some proposals. That's why we have to orient ourselves. That was exactly the work that's been done with the expertise to define what are the headline ambition and then to try to identify also experts in each of sector teams that can work together for each of the environmental objectives. They can work together and transversal check consistency. And then, of course, they work also together with all the other sector teams members to develop the technical screening criteria. We try to, of course, that was really, I would say, a priority for us in the sector teams to have different stakeholders. So all representatives from NGOs, from business, so that we can ensure that the development of the technical screening criteria can get a consensus from a group of people that can represent the society, that can represent the real world. Of course, it's relatively small, but that was, we have for an operative reason, no? Because we cannot have 100 people working with one sector team. It's complicated. Okay, so that was, as I said, example, or maybe I can tell you example of sector teams the way we are working is like agriculture, forestry, then we have a mining, then we have energy, then we have a transport, we have a manufacturing. It is actually divided into group because it's quite broad. 3 groups actually, because we have from chemicals to electronics, but also textile, food product and beverage, then restoration, remediation, and water supply. So that's approximately the main group that they are working separately, and of course with us, we coordinate with us in their work. I would pass the word to Ben, that he can give you a bit of insight how we define the headline of the environmental objective, and then we will go more in details in the 2 that are our topic.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Ben.
Thank you. Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, Marzia. Assume I'm audible?
Yes.
Perfect. Cool. So, yeah, this has been a real big challenge for us, is setting our environmental ambition levels within the work that we're doing. And what we mean by that is identifying what our landing point is, what we want to achieve in practice for those environmental objectives that can then help guide us on our technical screening criteria development, and also make it clear and understandable to investors and to companies what it is we're trying to achieve through this sort of financing. So this was done in the context of climate mitigation by the technical expert group that's fed into the delegated act process for mitigation and for adaptation. So to give you an idea about what we're talking about, for climate change mitigation, we had a clear objective to reach net zero emissions by 2050, a 50 to 55% reduction by 2030 compared to 1990 levels, and that is consistent with the commitments under the EU's Green Deal. That gives us a very clear, time-bound, specific landing point that we're trying to get to. That's what we're trying to achieve for mitigation. Now, we don't have that so clearly articulated for biodiversity, for water, for pollution, for circular economy. As Marzia has said, some of these different objectives are quite complex. We don't have full sets of indicators. So we've had to develop what we think is our headline ambition level for setting these technical screening criteria. Now, we've done that in a structured way, as you'd expect, and you'll see some of this information when we go out to public consultation in the summer. So a lot of what we're saying today will be included in the documents and the pack that you will see that accompanies the technical screening criteria. And there's more detail in there, so you'll have access to that for those of you that are engaging with that consultation to see exactly what we've written, to see all the footnotes, because it's quite a lot of text, quite a lot of work that's gone into that process. So the approach we took to identifying these headline ambition levels was based on a set of principles. And these principles underline some of the work we're doing in the technical working group itself. So be science-based was always our number one. So it's based on the evidence, it's based on the science. What do we need to achieve? When do we need to achieve it? What level of achievement do we need to get to? And when I say we, I'm talking about society as a whole to address the climate challenge, to address the biodiversity challenge, to improve the way we manage and use resources through circular economy, and so on and so forth. Ideally, we want this to be based on international agreements where they exist, like the Paris Agreement, because the taxonomy is operating in a global context. There are, we've heard this morning about other taxonomies in development, people looking to the EU in terms of where it's going, but also because we recognize that there are international agreements in some cases to which the EU is responding, like Paris, like the Convention on Biological Diversity, where we've got consistency between what's happening in EU policy and what's happening in the international context. This is our third principle. So reflecting the EU's response to those international agreements, because a lot of this will operate obviously within an EU context. We need to be consistent with EU law, legislation, and regulations, and so on. We also recognize that actually the EU leads on some of these different objectives. There might not be international agreements in some cases. So where the EU is showing leadership, we can use that as the basis of our sort of landing point, our headline ambition. And the final point, and this is quite crucial, and it's quite important to get clear in our technical work, is that these headline ambition levels are about the environmental objectives. And as such, they need to be independent of sectoral policy and sectoral scope. So we're not looking at sectoral legislation here to say, this is what our ambition level should be. We're taking the approach to say, this is what our ambition level should be for this environmental objective, because this is what we've signed up to internationally, or this is what the EU is trying to achieve. And then with our technical screening criteria, we're saying, well, how much can a sector contribute towards that? Can an activity contribute? And that's what we're developing within the technical screening criteria. So once we've got our landing point, once we've got our headline objective level, we can then say for forestry or for manufacturing or for transport, okay, well, how far can you go and what can you contribute given the scope of your activity? And that, we think, is a logical process to helping investors understand, okay, we understand where we want to get to on climate. I'm funding this particular manufacturing process. What is it that manufacturing process can actually do to improve in order to contribute towards that overall goal? Because we can't actually achieve these overall goals individually for all of our activities that we're developing criteria for. The environmental objectives themselves are different. That might seem like an obvious statement, but they sit in a different place in terms of how we try and address them through our technical screening criteria and how we address them when we're looking at our headline ambition levels. And we've used the driver pressure state impact response framework, for those that you are familiar with environmental approaches within the EU, certainly, to identify where they sit in that system and therefore what you can actually do to achieve those objectives. So the driver pressure state impact response approach identifies a driving force that leads to or causes a pressure. That pressure changes the state of an environmental objective or environmental system. That leads to impacts to which we want to develop responses. So if we look at our 4 objectives we're focusing on, pollution, we can consider that as a pressure, because pollutant of a water source or air pollution causes a pressure on the state of something else. So it might cause a pressure on the state of the water and marine environment. That's another one of our objectives. Or it might cause pressure on the state of biodiversity and ecosystems and change that state. So our pollution objective sits in the pressure space. Our water and marine and our biodiversity and ecosystems objectives sit more in the state space. And then we look at responses, and that's where the circular economy starts to come in. That's where we're looking at changing a systems approach or changing what we do with our natural resources that can create driving forces, that can reduce pressures, that can then help change the state in a positive way. So when we're setting these headline ambition levels and when we're developing our criteria, we're having to think slightly differently about our objectives and how we approach them. And this has been new in a way to the work of the platform, because it's before we've just had to focus on climate mitigation and adaptation. And now we're trying to address 4 objectives together, and we're trying to address sometimes 4 objectives for one activity. And that's obviously quite challenging in terms of how they relate to one another. There's also overlap between the objectives. So when we talk about things like pollution is measured in some cases around pollution impacts on water. That could be the chemical status of water. That's also a factor that describes what the state of water is like, the water environment. There's similar impacts and relationships with the water environment, which covers freshwater and marine, and also biodiversity and ecosystems, in which you can have freshwater and marine ecosystems. So some of our objectives overlap quite significantly. Some are related in different ways, so the circular economy and how it interacts with them, because of that driver pressure state impact response link. What does this mean for us in practice? Well, it means that we have to spend a lot of time, and our sector teams have to spend a lot of time identifying how an activity can actually contribute towards our headline ambition level, and what can it do, what can it affect, and what can it change in order to improve the condition or improve the state of that environmental objective. And it might be that we have to make decisions and say, well, this activity is polluting. We won't name them, but they're polluting and they can reduce their pollution, so they can contribute towards the pollution objective. Now, the logical next step of that is that will have a beneficial impact on the water and marine environment or biodiversity and ecosystems, but actually it might be one step removed. Whereas some activities might have a much more direct impact on the water and marine environment. So we can describe clearly in our technical screening criteria, this is what that activity would do, and this is how it would improve the status of that water and marine environment. In others, we might be describing, this is what the activity can do, and this is how much it needs to do it in order to reduce its pollution levels. But all those are set in the context of those headline ambition levels. So we'll give, as Marzia said, we'll give 2 examples. I'll hand back to Marzia now to go through the circular economy one, just how we've treated that, and then I'll talk a little bit about the biodiversity one, and how we deal with things like offsetting and how we've dealt with the difference between, say, managed ecosystems and semi-natural ecosystems, just to give you a bit of context to how they are articulated from our perspective in terms of headline ambition level, and also how we treat them differently within our work as well. And again, I'll just reiterate, all of this is, well, not all this slide deck, but all of the detail behind this will be going into our public call for feedback. So you'll get to see the detail there and understand how and why our criteria are set as they're set. That's it.
Thank you, Ben. Yes. Circular economy. Circular economy, I think, is no. Personally, I work on the sustainability, so circular economy is one of my topic. But I think it's one of the most challenging one, because for different reasons. If you read the Article 13 that describe what could be a substantial contribution of circular economy, you found there a list of different activity, a different action that can be done. And then automatically that's linked to possible different metrics that could be used to measure it. I give you just an example. I mean, if you read the Article 13, we are talking about use natural resources. So increase durability, reparability, upgradability, reusability of a product. So already I measured, I gave you already like 4 different metrics that could be assessed in completely different way, depends on the activity, depends on the product that you are managing. So then we have increase of use of secondary raw materials. So maybe that's at least it's a bit easier. Reduce the content of hazardous substances, substitute with substances that have, substitute completely all the substances that have high concern. Prevent and reduce waste generation. So all of these activities are I would say activity maybe is not right. All this action, it's better. Action or measures are possible example of substantial contribution. So we have 2 different points. We have 2 different challenges in our work. First of all is to identify for each of these of the activity, that's more the roles that is played by the sector teams members, and they have to look the activity, look at the Article 13, understand in that specific case where the economic activity can bring a substantial contribution. So which is the reference value? What is the metrics has to be measured? From our side, from report side, we thought, okay, but how we can inspire them, how we can give them a headline, where we go, because of course, circular economy, it's clearly fixed. At least in his vision by European Commission, but it's a vision. It's not really something that you have a percentage, no? So you have a list or again of possible value. That's why we work together with the sector teams, in particular with the experts that are in our group on circular economy, to try to define what are the headline ambition in these regards. And one, was a long process, because of course we have to also, from one side, we have to define a measurement, something, but in the same time has to be something reliable, feasible. So what was as a first was, for example, that by 2050, economic activities are largely decoupled. So that's the decoupling from environmental and from resource consumption, and are rebuilding natural capital through circular design by eliminating waste and pollution, keeping materials and products in use, and regenerating natural systems. So this is the big hot, I would say, hotspot, hotline that we have for other reference spot. But when I talking, I actually read, because I don't remember. And there is a lot of things. There are decoupling, so that's clear, the concept decoupling resource consumption from production, of course. But then, of course, the design, the circular design already, so I mean the circularity already included and integrated in the design phase, that of course play a really huge role in already developing something that will be recyclable afterwards, it could be recycled afterwards. And then of course, acting at the end of life of the product is reducing waste. So somehow recycling increase the length, the lifespan of a product, increasing ensuring reparability of the product. So that are all the things. There are, of course, for all the most of these words most of the measures that I already mentioned, there are, we try to define a more detailed target. But one that I want to mention, just one, we recognize the one measure that could be really somehow help us to address substantial contribution is a material footprint. So, for example, in the because the headline of ambition are divided in one more general that I already mentioned to you, and then we give a more clearly direction for several measures. And one in this case is exactly the material footprint that should be reduced by 50% by 2030 and 75% by 2050. So that is one of the measures that can help us to help the investor to identify substantial contribution against the circular economy. I stop and I pass the word to Ben, otherwise it will be too late, about biodiversity, but happy to discuss further afterwards.
Thank you. No, very clear. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Marzia. Thanks, Jonathan. So biodiversity and ecosystems, for those that like reading the detail of this, the taxonomy regulation articles 10 through 15 are where they set out in legislation all of the contributions that are expected in a substantial contribution context, and it's that we're interpreting, and it's that Marzia went through initially. So biodiversity and ecosystems is slightly different, as we said. It's a state that we're trying to achieve. So the regulation includes things like achieving favorable conservation status, protecting and restoring terrestrial, marine, and other aquatic ecosystems, improving their condition, including adequate protection. And it talks about sustainable agricultural practices, sustainable forest management, and so on. So it's really helpful for saying what substantial contribution would be, but it doesn't give you the granularity that we can actually measure. How much protected? How far restored? How much do we improve condition? So it doesn't help when we're looking to set criteria and say, okay, we're going to measure something that's happened. Are we measuring an improvement of 1, or are we measuring an improvement of 10? And so on. So again, this is sort of context as to why we needed to have some sort of landing point, the headline ambition level. I'll read you the biodiversity one, so you can sort of understand the headline that we've got. To ensure by 2050, all of the world's ecosystems and their services are restored to good ecological condition, they're resilient, and they are adequately protected. Now, I recognize that we've said adequately there without defining it. I'll come on to that in a moment. The objectives that EU biodiversity strategy will be achieved at least by 2030. So it gives us a clear link to the EU strategy and the strategy targets. And from today, the world's biodiversity needs to be put on a path to recovery, and no deterioration in conservation trends and status of all protected habitats and species by 2030 will be ensured. So that paragraph is still quite general. As Marzia said, we've got these general headline statements that give us our time-bound specifics. But there's more granularity that goes with that. So the document that this comes from has a further page of text talking about what does adequately protected mean, what does resilient mean, and it gives links to definitions in things like the Convention on Biological Diversity, the EU's biodiversity strategy, the Birds and Habitats directives, and so on. And what we've also done is included a whole list of the stated targets and obligations that are provided through EU legislation and through international agreements for all of our objectives to help guide our sector teams, because those targets will, sometimes they're general, but sometimes they're specific to a given activity or a given type of activity. And that recognizes that some activities need to do more or different things in the context of these different headline ambitions. It's a lot to take in like this. It's a lot to take in without slides. And again, you'll have access to see this information written down. The two things I wanted to say before we sort of close or go to any questions is we're not, let me frame that in a positive. We're trying to be clear here about exactly what it is that we want to see achieved for each environmental objective at a general level, and then also through the technical screening criteria at a very specific, measurable level. And the question of offsetting came up, particularly in the context of biodiversity, because it's relatively standard practice for many industries. It links to doing things like environmental impact assessments and then saying, okay, we recognize we will have some impact, but we can deal with it, we can offset it in some way, shape, or form. Again, as I said before, we're not focusing on starting this from a sectoral perspective. We're starting this from an environmental perspective, and then asking our sectors to figure out, well, how can they contribute? So offsetting, we had to spend a bit of time figuring out, well, how does this fit within our framework? Where would we put offsetting? Is it substantial contribution? Is it do no significant harm? Are there any particular conditions that we would need to put with that? Now, offsetting was not included for climate mitigation. So there's precedence there within the technical experts group's recommendations, but also the delegated act, that offsetting is not a means by which you can achieve substantial contribution to climate. So we took a similar approach for biodiversity in this context, very specifically biodiversity, but we can apply that also to our water objective. So we're making a clear distinction here that it's not part of substantial contribution for a number of reasons. It's not considered for climate, so we would be inconsistent, I think, if we did that. It's the last step in the mitigation hierarchy, and I'm talking about mitigation of impact here, not climate mitigation. So you avoid harm, you mitigate, et cetera, before you get to offsetting. For offsetting to actually be needed, you would have to have caused some harm in the first place, which is a problem for how we interpret the regulation. We should not be causing harm with activities that are looking to provide substantial contribution, and so on and so forth. So we're not considering it as part of our substantial contribution framework, but it can be part of our do no significant harm. And this is something that Nadia was talking about earlier. But there are certain conditions we've applied to this, because again, offsetting assumes some sort of impact has actually happened. And we want to try and avoid those negative impacts, and we're focusing more on funding positive activities that are doing good things now, preventing deterioration now, helping to improve condition and state of ecosystems now from this point forwards, rather than saying, okay, we're going to put in this big project, it's going to have this huge impact, but it's okay, we'll offset it at the end. Because it's never guaranteed that you get an offsetting in practice. They can be part of do no significant harm, we think, under three conditions: that it achieves net gain in areas of high biodiversity. So we're actually saying, okay, you can do offsetting there, providing that in that area of high biodiversity, we're seeing a net gain take place. So we're actually slightly improving the system as it was. In all other areas, no net loss would be acceptable through an offsetting approach under do no significant harm. But we must ensure that there's ecological equivalence. And by that, we mean that the biodiversity that we are and ecosystems that we are offsetting in this context are the same ones that have been impacted. So to give a concrete example, if we've caused an impact on a wetland, it's no good planting some trees and saying, okay, we've offset some biodiversity. It's not the same biodiversity we're talking about. So there needs to be that equivalent. But again, this is all part of our do no significant harm framework. It's ensuring that our baseline, that no significant harm has come as a result of the activities that were taking place. Meanwhile, that same activity will be providing a substantial contribution to another environmental objective, whether that's circular economy, whether that's climate, or something else. The final thing that I'll say is activities have a very distinct relationship with biodiversity and ecosystems. And typically, what we might want to see for biodiversity and ecosystem or conditionable water is a near natural state. That would be the ultimate perfect thing to have. Your natural bits of the Amazon, for example, extreme example, is what we might think of, okay, there we've got a really good ecosystem. Obviously, economic activities interact with ecosystems in different ways, and relatively few interact with semi-natural and natural ecosystems without causing some sort of impact. So we've identified different substantial contribution types of biodiversity for semi-natural ecosystems and what that would actually mean. But we also recognize quite a number of activities interact with ecosystems in a way that leads them to be managed in some form. So we can't really call them natural, but they are still providing some biodiversity. They're still important for biodiversity. They're still important ecosystems, but they interact much more closely with the activity themselves. So agriculture and forestry are good examples of this. They interact in a way that can cause harm, but they can also manage the ecosystem in a sustainable way. So we're defining substantial contribution types for those managed ecosystems as well. And they're distinct and separate from those natural ecosystems, obviously within a continuum. And the final thing is that we're also saying there are means of contributing substantially to biodiversity where you're addressing a legacy impact of a previous activity. And this was really important because with the first two, we miss out where we want to see financing going and dealing with some legacy impact that's happened in the past. I don't know, some sort of big infrastructure project might have caused some big impact, but now we're saying, well, actually, we want to channel sustainable finance to address the fact that that impact has happened and provide a substantial contribution to biodiversity. A concrete example we used was the motorway infrastructure has gone through a habitat and it's caused it to be fragmented. So one means of substantial contribution could be through constructing a wildlife bridge, for example. So providing a substantial contribution to biodiversity through an activity that addresses an impact caused by different activity after the fact. So as you can see, this is sort of a bit more at the granular level in terms of how we're addressing it in the criteria approach, but it gives us different ways of allowing a substantial contribution for biodiversity to happen for different activities because they all interact differently. And it's the same with the circular economy, and it's the same with all of our objectives. I think I'll stop there. We're close to time, and maybe hand back to Marzia or Jonathan.
We are close to time, I'm afraid, because actually your very clear presentations have prompted a huge number of questions and thoughts in my mind, but we don't really have time to go into them now. No doubt we'll go into them with the panel in a minute. But can I just ask you one question, just very, very briefly, just for my edification and to help set the scene? I think that it's in one of the messages which comes out very clearly is that compared to the climate objectives, one has to, as it were, invent or agree on both a set of objectives which one is seeking to hit, and indeed a set of criteria by which you can measure progress towards those. And the impression I'm taking is that this is necessarily a more qualitative process as far as these objectives are concerned than is the case with climate. So there's inevitably going to be a certain amount of continuing debate about how one deals with it. The question that is popped into my mind is, and this is a very sort of simple question, did you you talked a little bit there about different aspects within individual objectives, but have you discussed the extent to which the various objectives at the higher level might or might not conflict with one another? And to that extent, how do you sort of broker that? To put the question another way, is there a sort of hierarchy of objectives which we're looking at here, or do we just take each one take each one on its own and address it as it is?
Maybe I can start. I mean, two things. Actually, we don't make any hierarchy on the environmental objective, but when we are addressing the economic activity, you give automatically a hierarchy because you give substantial contribution for one, so you focus on it, and you guarantee in the same time that no significant harm occur to the other five. So that's the way to address the trade-off, a typical trade-off. So try to balance. So it's not at the really strategic level. There we work more to try to see which are the if they are the ambition of level are consistent at the same level, but not too much on the trade-off. The trade-off come more when you are working on economic activity. Maybe Ben can add something more, but before to pass to him, I want to just add, I will not say that's more qualitative, because at the end, the qualitative and quantitative, if you see the Directed Act, I mean, it's quite similar. It's more granular. That's the point, because you don't have just one measure for each of environmental objective. You have a band. You have a set of indicators, a set of metrics you have to follow up. Ben.
Yeah, I agree with that, Marzia. I think, as you say, there's no hierarchy. We have. It's dealt with quite neatly in the taxonomy regulation. You contribute substantially to one or more objective, but you do no significant harm to the others. So in that sense, you ensure that harm doesn't befall the others. Sure, you're choosing in a way an objective that you want to contribute towards, but that's the gift of the taxonomy. You get that choice, assuming you have criteria to measure against. But we're not saying that climate is more important than biodiversity, or biodiversity is more important than water. That's yeah, that's an endless debate for academic study, I think.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much, and thank you first of all for taking the time to participate. But thank you also for the clarity with which you've summarised the work which you've been doing up to now. And I'm sure we're all agog for the documentation and when it comes out, and being able to read up more on this. But there's plenty of food for thought here. Thanks again for these very, very clear presentations.